This is Audible.
The Neighbor, Parts 1 through 3, Lust in the Suburbs. Written by Abby Weeks. Narrated by Bailey Varnas. Part 1. Chapter 1. When Benjamin and Janie Carver moved to Sunny Oaks, a beautiful and expensive suburb outside of Troy, New York, they vowed it would be a new beginning for their marriage. The last 5 years had taken their toll. They'd been living in an adorable little apartment overlooking Ferry Street. Ben was a lawyer who worked for a firm specializing in commercial real estate. Janie was a teacher at the local school. They thought they had everything a young couple needed to be happy. They had good jobs, a nice home, and they'd even been best friends since their junior year of college. Life treated them well. Janie would pick up a bottle of wine and fresh groceries from one of the local delis on her way home from work and cook dinner. She'd pour the wine, light the candles, and put on some nice music. Everything would be ready by the time Ben got in from the office. Often, after dinner, they'd go out and catch a movie or watch some live music in one of the local bars. They were regulars at all the trendiest bars and restaurants around town, and a lot of people knew them. They'd gone on happily like that for the first couple of years, but gradually, life began to get in the way. Ben would stay at the office later, or would call to say he wouldn't be home for dinner at all. Janie started watching TV in the evenings and lost her enthusiasm for the local entertainment scene. They'd talked about having a baby, but deep down, Janie sensed that it would have been for all the wrong reasons. She wanted to have a child with Ben someday, but she wasn't even 30 yet and was still enjoying her career as a teacher too much to take the time off for a baby. She believed a couple should only have a child when they were ready and really wanted it, not just when they'd fallen into a rut and needed a way to get out of it. And it wasn't like the marriage was beyond saving. They still had a lot of fun together when they remembered to relax and take time for each other. They often went on trips together, up to the Finger Lakes, where they did wine tastings and spent time on the water, or down to New York City to check out a few shows and look in the galleries and boutiques. Janie was confident that they'd get through the slump. It would just take a little effort from both of them. But then, the unthinkable happened. Ben came home from work very late, which wasn't unusual at that point. Janie was already in bed. She'd been sleeping naked that night. They hadn't made love all week, and she was feeling the need to connect. She heard Ben fumble his way into the apartment noisily. He'd obviously been drinking. He often had to entertain clients. He fell into bed next to her, and when he noticed that she was naked, he began to fondle her drunkenly. He put his hands on her breasts and inside her legs. She opened her legs a little to let him get better access to her, and he slid his finger inside her vagina. She loved the feeling of being fingered. It always reminded her of her first sexual experiences as a teenager in the back of cars. She let him move his finger in and out of her, getting her excited and wet. She moaned a little. She got down under the covers and took him in her mouth. He firmed up immediately, and she let the long, thick shaft of his penis slide deep into her throat. She thought about doing something naughty. She wanted to put her finger in his bum. He would never admit it, but she knew it excited him. She was just about to do it when he moaned something. At first, she thought she'd misheard him, so she listened carefully. He moaned again, and she realized he was saying a name, and it wasn't her name. Susie, he was saying. And she knew instantly what it meant. Susie was his secretary. What a cliché. Janie had spoken to her dozens of times on the phone. She sounded young and sexy, and she always left her feeling slightly ill at ease when she got off the phone. She knew Ben was working too much, but he was also having fun over there in that office. He was entertaining clients at bars and having evening meetings in fancy restaurants. And it seemed no matter how late she called, Susie was always at the office, ready to answer the phone. She should have known something was up. She didn't say anything that night. She just finished sucking Ben off till he came in her mouth, and all the while she pictured Susie doing the very same thing to him. She didn't say anything because she didn't want to go through the turmoil that it would cause. He'd slipped up. He was a pig. She knew that. But she also knew that the marriage had grown boring, and that if she was going to keep Ben, she'd have to change things. She vowed that night to make those changes in their marriage. Rather than fight with Ben, she'd create a new life for them both. The very first thing on her list was to get him out of that office, and that meant leaving Troy. There were wealthy suburbs around the city and good firms in Albany. She'd move him out of town and take him away from Susie. Chapter 2. Scarcely a month later, Janie was sitting in her new living room, admiring the beautiful new house she and Ben had just bought. They'd paid more than they should have. The neighborhood was way out of their reach, but she reasoned that his career would be taking off in the next few years, and he'd be able to pay for it all easily. She enjoyed having the house to herself. It had been a hectic weekend, and the movers had all just left. She and Ben had just spent the week packing their things, and the move had gone off without a hitch. Now that all their belongings were unpacked, she sat on the couch and tried to unwind. She went and got a bottle of Merlot from the kitchen and poured herself a glass. They would need some new furniture. This was a lot more house than they were used to, but things didn't look that bad with their old things. It was perfectly livable, and she was actually quite excited to go shopping for all the new things they would need here. She sat back and enjoyed the feeling of having started a new life. This neighborhood was desirable and impressive. They'd settle in here, and Ben would forget all about some slutty secretary in town. She knew she could make this happen for both of them. She thought about turning on the TV, but then stopped herself. She was determined to make the best of this new life, and sitting around watching TV all afternoon wasn't part of it. There was a fabulous gym close by. She should check that out. She had a great body, but she could always make it better. She wanted to breathe new life into her marriage, and looking her best was crucial to that. It was summer vacation, so she was off work for 2 months. She could use that time to get in shape, get new clothes, show Ben what he could lose if he kept screwing around with Susie. Ben had just left to go into the office for a few hours. He'd been there to help with the move, but then he got a call from work. He'd apologized. They were supposed to spend the afternoon together, but she'd forced him to promise he'd be out of there by 6. They would celebrate the move by meeting at her favorite restaurant downtown. It was an Italian place on Church that they used to go to all the time when they were newlyweds, Tironi's. It was very fancy. Then, they'd drive home together in Ben's car. She'd leave hers at the restaurant and would get a ride into town in the morning with Ben to pick it up. When they got home, she planned to seduce him, show him what he was missing by spending all his time at the office with Susie. She was excited. She went upstairs to her new bedroom. It was a truly magnificent room, with floor-to-ceiling glass along one wall overlooking the backyard. The bed faced that view, and she imagined what it would be like to wake up every morning to the rising sun shining in through that wall of glass. They didn't have a pool yet, but the neighbor did, and she planned on putting one in as soon as they had the money. She felt like she was living in Los Angeles or Miami when she looked at that window. It was so modern and chic. She lay on the bed and looked out, pretending the neighbor's pool was hers. She pictured the pool parties they'd have with all of the new people they'd be meeting out here. Then she thought of the new corset. She'd bought new lingerie to seduce Ben with, and she wanted to try it on. It was a beautiful black piece that the salesperson had referred to as a torsolette. It was made of Spanish lace and had cost far more than she could afford to be spending on underwear. She went to her dresser and took it out of the drawer. It was still in the pink crepe paper the store had wrapped it in, and she unwrapped it and laid it out on the bed. Then she stripped and went into the bathroom to shower. In the shower, she shaved and put on new body lotion that she'd bought at the same lingerie store. She came out of the bathroom and admired her naked body in the full-length mirror. She looked at her breasts, small but pert, her flat stomach, and turned to look at her firm little bottom. Not bad, she thought. She would spend a lot of time this summer working out, she promised herself. But in the meantime, she had more than enough ammunition to persuade Ben that he still loved her. She went over to the bed and picked up the torsolette and put it on over her head. It was a perfect fit. The camisole was tight and firm because of the intricate lacework, and it fit like a corset. She admired the lace. The quality of the workmanship really was impressive. She rubbed her hands over it and checked that the brassiere cups fit her breasts perfectly. They did, and even gave her a little more cleavage than usual. This really was a flattering garment, she thought. She looked at herself again in the mirror. The corset came down to her waist, leaving her freshly shaved vagina exposed, and she admired that, opening the lips slightly and imagining what Ben would think when he saw her in it. The vertical seams going up the side of the bodice gave it a thinning structure. She twirled. If this doesn't work, she thought, nothing will. She still wasn't quite sure what her plan was with Ben. She'd talked him into buying this house in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the area, and she knew that having a family here was part of the plan. But other than that, she didn't really know what the future held. All she knew was that they needed a change. She wanted to get them out of the rut they had fallen into, and she wanted to get him away from Susie. That wouldn't happen as long as he was spending all sorts of hours with her in that cramped little office downtown. Out here was where the real money was. She knew that much. She'd done her research. Everyone who was anyone in Troy, Albany, or Schenectady lived in this area. And there were firms based in Albany that made real money. It was the state capital, after all. People thought everything had to happen down in the city, but they forgot that a lot of important decisions were made up here in Albany. There was money and power, and she knew it would catch Ben's eye once he started spending time out here. She'd already planned to get him a golf club membership for Christmas. It would cost her 2 months of her teaching salary, but it would be worth it. In fact, she probably wouldn't even have to work that hard on Ben. He was smart when it came to his career, and he'd be more aware than she was of the opportunities for a young lawyer in Albany once he started spending time out here. Troy was too small for him, and it was about time he realized that. They'd both rise above that little town and move on to more exciting things. She went over to the glass wall to admire the view of the swimming pool again. She couldn't wait till they had their own. But when she got there, she got the shock of her life. In the next house over was a man standing at his own window, and he had the perfect view of everything she did in the bedroom. Oh my gosh, she thought, and put her hand to her mouth. She'd been twirling and admiring her pussy in this lacy little number for the last half hour, and he could have been there watching the entire time. Oh my gosh, she thought again, and this time the thought was accompanied by a throb of desire in her thighs. The man's house was enormous. He must have been seriously wealthy, and she hadn't noticed till now that from its height he had a pretty good view right into her bedroom. And not only that, but if her eyes weren't deceiving her, he was smiling lasciviously at her. He was standing there, bold as could be, and she was looking right back at him with nothing on but the lacy black corset which barely came down to her waist, and they were both smiling. Chapter 3. Janie's face flushed. She'd been waltzing around the room in her torsolette without a care in the world, and this man had been watching the whole thing. He didn't even have the decency to hide himself now that she'd spotted him. The way the houses were situated, he wasn't very far from her at all, and she could see that he had a thick crop of white hair and was probably somewhere in his mid-60s. He was just standing there, looking down at her, and she was still naked from the waist down. This was shocking. How was she supposed to go around the neighborhood when this guy had seen what he'd seen? He must have seen her admiring her pussy in the mirror, opening the lips, checking her breasts, all of it. And yet, all she could think was how rich he was, and handsome. He was handsome for an older man. To her surprise, she realized she wasn't nearly as embarrassed as she should be. He was still there, just standing by the window looking at her, and she was still giving him a perfect view of the corset from the front, her pert little breasts just aching to pop out of their cups for his viewing pleasure. Janie felt a flush of excitement at the thought. She'd never done anything like this in her life. Ben was the only man who'd seen her naked in almost 10 years. But standing there now, looking her absolute best in front of this stranger, she felt the electricity of desire flowing through her veins. She hadn't felt excitement as intense as this in years. She was glad he'd caught her like this. She knew she must have looked stunning to him in this outfit. It was the sexiest piece of lingerie she'd ever owned, and she'd just lathered herself in lotion and shaved so her vagina would look as fresh and young as that of a teenager. This was her chance, she thought, to make a real impression on someone who might be able to do a lot for her life. She looked up at him and just knew he was a big player. She felt glued to the window. She looked up again at the man, and he was still there, looking right at her. He was attractive enough, tall, tanned with dark eyes and a strong face. He was wearing a polo shirt and slacks. She couldn't help it, but the fact that his house must have been worth millions, with a beautiful pool in the back and a whole fleet of luxury cars in the front, excited her endlessly. For a second, she wondered if the new life she was planning wasn't with Ben at all. For all she knew, it could be with this distinguished neighbor, or someone else she would meet up here in the exclusive hills overlooking the Hudson and the state capitol. Slowly, she reached up and grabbed the rod that controlled the curtains and twisted it. The lace curtains pulled back to the edges of the room, exposing it entirely to the man. Now he would be able to see everything. She smiled playfully at him, and he smiled faintly back at her. She felt another thrill when she saw him put his hand down to his crotch and rub his penis through his slacks. This is too much, she thought, but immediately she let that thought fade away. Who would have thought that something like this would happen to her just by moving out to the suburbs? She'd come out here to rekindle her marriage, and now she was standing in the most exposed position possible, in front of a wall of glass and an old, wealthy neighbor who was scarcely 20 yards from her, taking it all in. He was old enough to be her father. That thought thrilled her too. She put her hand down to her vagina and touched it. He seemed to like that, from the look on his face. What was she going to do? She didn't even know, but she knew the man was anticipating it already. She knew she was playing with fire here, but she didn't think she could possibly get in any trouble for this. After all, she was simply getting dressed in her own house for a date she'd planned with her own husband. As long as no one found out about it, everything would be fine. She could have a little fun with the man in the window. She thought of Ben with Susie, and that banished all fear from her mind. She hadn't even told Ben she knew about his affair. She'd basically let him off the hook. If she could overlook that for the sake of their marriage, then surely she could allow herself this small, naughty pleasure. She went back to her bed and looked over her shoulder. The neighbor was still standing there. She bent over to give him a good look at her ass. She crossed her legs, as she'd seen strippers do in movies, and bent over at the waist to let him see her buttocks and the little slit of her pussy. Then she pulled open her butt cheeks a little so that he could see her sexy, pink little asshole in the middle. She sat on the bed. The torsolette had come with detachable garters and stockings, and she put them on, one after the other, up over her feet, all the way up her legs. She then tightened them around her thighs, tighter than she was used to. She felt as if she had to make up for the distance and the glass of the windows that the neighbor was watching her through, so she tightened the garters till they hurt. Now, her legs were covered in the same exquisite black lace that the corset was made of. She went back over to the window to let the neighbor see. She lifted one leg up against the glass pane like a ballerina and rested it on the window. He'd never be able to get a better look at her than this. She pouted her lips and made a kissing motion at him. Then she took her leg down and lifted her arms up over her head like a ballerina and stretched upward. She got on her toes and did a little twirl, slowly, so that he could see her from every angle. She was still entirely naked in the places where it counted. Her vagina and bottom were completely exposed between the top of the stockings and the bottom of the corset, and with her stretched up so tall, she felt he could see her as perfectly as possible. She looked up at him, and to her surprise, he made a little circling motion with his finger, like he wanted her to do another twirl. She smiled at him as graciously as she could, and then twirled slowly again. She looked up at him, a little shyly, and he nodded his head. It seemed she had pleased him. She did a little bow, and he laughed. This was going to be fun. Chapter 4. She stood there a little awkwardly for a minute, wondering what would happen next. She had no idea what the etiquette was for a situation like this, and she didn't know what was the right way to bring it to an end. Then, to her relief, the neighbor lifted his finger and then pointed at his watch. He seemed to be saying that he had to go away for a minute, but that he would be right back. Janie went and lay on her bed. She felt elated. She hadn't had this much fun in years. All the work she was doing to rekindle her marriage, and all she'd had to do with the stranger was let her look at her, and it had given her a bigger thrill. It was crazy. With a pang of guilt, she picked up the phone and dialed Ben's office. Susie picked up, of course. Janie tried to make her voice as friendly as possible as she asked to speak to Ben. "Hi, honey," he said. "Just checking in." "How's the house?" "Oh, it's perfect. I've just been straightening out the bedroom." "It's quite a room, isn't it?" "It's perfect, honey. How's work?" She looked up and saw that the neighbor was back in his position, watching her on the phone. She felt a rush of excitement mixed with guilt as she made small talk with her husband. But then, he was with Susie, wasn't he? "Work's work," Ben said. "Well, I don't want to keep you," she said. "I was just checking in." "Okay, honey. Well, I'll see you tonight." "We're meeting at the restaurant at 6, right?" She confirmed and told him bye. She could hardly wait to get him off the phone. The neighbor was back in his position behind his own wall of glass, and Janie was surprised to see that he'd brought himself a chair to sit in. And not only that, but he'd opened his slacks and was holding his erect penis in his hand. Janie's jaw dropped. If Ben could have seen this, he would have died. The thought of that thrilled her as much as the neighbor's penis did. She looked up at the neighbor from her bed and put her finger into her mouth. He smiled as he stroked his member. Then, she took the finger from her mouth and touched the lips of her vagina with it. She looked at him and then down at her finger and inserted it all the way into her wet, warm pussy. Her pussy was dying for it, for anything, preferably something bigger than a finger, but that was all it was getting, and it swallowed it up hungrily. She looked up at the neighbor again, and he was enjoying himself. He was stroking himself faster now, and she could see that he was very well endowed. She arched her back and lifted her bum off of the bed so that he'd be able to get a better view of her vagina as she slipped her finger in and out of it rhythmically. She leaned her head back and let herself penetrate in and out, faster and faster, and she imagined what it would be like to take the neighbor's penis inside her. Oh, how she longed right then to feel his thick, tanned dick inside her, fucking her. She thought of him, all that money, all that maturity, and how good it would feel to be his little girl. She knew a man like that would adore her. There's no way a 60-year-old would cheat on a wife who wasn't even 30 yet. He would adore her and give her everything she ever wanted or needed, and she would reward him with the most pleasurable, beautiful sex he could imagine. She would do everything to please him and make sure he was the happiest, most satisfied husband ever. She would be his nymph, his little girl, and he would be able to do with her as he wished. She felt that she was close to coming when she stopped herself. She really wanted to make an impression on this man, and she didn't know how often she would get the opportunity to display herself like this. She would give him something he would never forget, she thought. There was something else that she wanted to show him while she had his attention, and she wasn't going to miss her chance. She got off the bed and went over to the window and smiled at him. He was still sitting there in his chair, with his dick in his hand, and he didn't look like he was going anywhere. She went back to her dresser and opened the bottom drawer. Inside it, under a lot of old socks and underwear, was her dildo. She hadn't used it in a while, but it was about 12 inches long, and it was very thick. It was made from pitch black glass, and it slid into her so easily. She brought it over to the window and showed it to him, and he smiled and nodded. Then she went back to the bed. This time, she didn't get on her back, but onto her hands and knees. She faced the wall and let her bum face him, giving him the best possible view. Then, she touched the tip of the dildo not against the lips of her vagina, but against her asshole. She'd never been taken anally in her life, but it was something she thought about sometimes when she was being naughty. She got up and got a bottle of body lotion from the bathroom and returned to the window. She let the neighbor watch as she lathered the lotion all over the dildo. Then, she turned her back to him and lathered it all over her bum too, slipping her finger in and out of her anus to wet it. Then, she got back on her hands and knees, not on the bed, but on the floor in front of the window, and pushed the dildo lightly against her anus. Then, she pushed it more firmly, forcing the tip of it inside her. There was a mixture of pain and pleasure as it broke its way into her bum, but the pain disappeared as soon as it was inside. Then, she slid the dildo, inch by inch, deeper and deeper into her bum. She pulled it out slowly, and she thought she would die as it moved out. And then, when she felt she couldn't take it any more, she pushed it back inside her. It felt so good. She repeated the motion again and let the pleasure of it pour around inside her like a liquid. She was dying. It felt so good. She turned and looked at the neighbor. He was still with her every step of the way. She placed the dildo on the ground and then, facing him with her legs spread wide open, lowered her anus back onto the tip of it. She felt her thigh muscles burn, but she loved the feeling of it. The neighbor looked ecstatic as he watched her. She made the sexiest face she could as she looked at him, and then rose herself up and down on the dildo so that it was fucking her in the ass. She was glad she was in such good shape, because the muscles in her thighs were burning as she held herself up over the dildo with her legs spread wide open like that. The dildo was staying in position so she could support herself by putting both of her hands against the glass, palms out. She took one of her hands off the glass and touched her vagina. She pushed her finger in and out of her throbbing vagina while motioning up and down on the dildo until finally it became too much and she climaxed. Her hips thrust forward as she orgasmed again and again, and she was looking right at the neighbor as she did so. To her delight, he was coming all over his hand at the same time. She took some juice from her pussy onto her finger and put it in her mouth. He smiled at her, and she smiled back. Then she got up and went into the bathroom for yet another shower. When she got out, he was gone. She stood by the window for a minute and looked across at his room. She was going to enjoy living here. She knew it. Chapter 5. That evening, she put the torsolette back on when she was dressed for dinner. She tied it as tight as she dared and put the stockings and garters on and fastened them to the corset. Then she put on the best little black dress she had and drove into the city with a wicked smile on her face. Living in the suburbs was going to be a lot more fun than she had thought. She was feeling strong and excited, like life held all sorts of possibilities for her, and today had just been a taste of what was to come. She was looking forward to entertaining the handsome neighbor across the way, and she wondered what other exciting things it would lead to. She wondered if her future really was with Ben, or if maybe it was with someone else, like the neighbor, someone rich and powerful and charming who knew how to appreciate her. She pulled up to the front of Tironi's and handed her keys to the valet. He was a cute guy with medium brown hair, and she gave him a naughty wink as he took the keys from her. She flicked her wrist just then and dropped the keys on the ground. She opened the car door and turned to get out. The boy bent down to pick up the car keys, and she was still sitting on the car seat, looking down at him. It was an incredible opportune position, and she didn't intend to waste it. She was done wasting opportunities. The boy looked up at her, and she gave him the sexiest, sultriest smile she could. Then, very slowly, she spread open her legs so that he could see under the skirt of her little dress to her gartered legs, and most importantly of all, to her beautiful, shaved, bare vagina. "Jesus," the kid said. He was barely 20. "I know, right?" she said. "What I wouldn't give to have a taste of that." "Touch it," she said. The kid reached up and put his hand inside her dress and gently touched the lips of her vagina. "Go on," she said. He looked at her and then pushed his finger into her. It felt amazing. It was the first touch she'd had down there from anyone but Ben in so long, and she realized she craved it. "That's enough," she said. "That's the best tip I'll get all night," the boy said. She smiled at him and got out of the car and went into the restaurant. Ben was sitting at a really great table by a window overlooking the street. They talked about the new house and new beginnings and about bringing new life to their marriage. He listened to everything she said and seemed to be excited about it all. She looked at him and thought of Susie, and then she thought of the neighbor and the new life she felt flowing through her veins. After a while, she stopped listening to him and just looked past him, out to the valet boy working outside. She was going to enjoy this new beginning. That much was certain. Part 2. Chapter 1. Janie enjoyed the meal at Tironi's. Ben was charming and made for good company. She could tell he was excited about all the opportunities and prospects that had opened up for them as a result of moving out to Sunny Oaks. It was going to be a new beginning for both of them. She could feel it. "I was talking to Jack about it," Ben said. "About opportunities?" "Switching to an Albany firm." "He won't tell any of the partners, will he?" "I doubt it. He practically admitted he was thinking of doing the same thing." "Well, it makes sense. They make so much more money over there. They have all that regulatory stuff to deal with, and all that work coming out of the state capitol." "It's not just that," Ben said. "There's also a lot of real estate work. That's what Jack said. Public appropriations, highways, big projects, things like that. Millions of dollars in fees." "Well, did he give you any names?" "He mentioned a few firms. No names in particular, though." "Well, he won't blab to anyone before you're ready to make a move, will he?" "Honey, I'd say he'd be ready to jump ship with me if I can find the right deal." "That would be nice. You could both move together." Janie enjoyed this career talk. It had always been one of the things that had attracted her to Ben. He had ambition. He was driven to succeed, and she knew that he would never give up until he'd made it. He would be a big deal someday. She believed that. And she could overlook a few indiscretions with secretaries along the way if it meant he'd take her to the top with him. In fact, more and more, she was thinking of enjoying a few indiscretions of her own. She thought about what had happened at the house earlier. It had been really crazy performing for the neighbor. He'd orgasmed as he'd watched her come. It was incredible. She was as close as she could be to actually cheating on Ben, and she still wasn't crossing the line. Well, maybe she was, but she didn't care. She blushed when she thought about what had happened with the valet attendant just moments before. She'd actually let him touch her. He was just a kid. That was so incredibly reckless, she couldn't believe she'd done that. What if Ben saw? It was truly crazy, but it felt so good. She looked out past Ben at the attendants taking keys from the glitzy restaurant patrons as they pulled up. It was probably the most popular restaurant in Troy right now, at least for the upwardly mobile and those with aspirations, the people who were trying to get to the top. It was a thrill to be there, sitting across from Ben, who really did look rather dashing in his dark blue suit. His blue eyes flashed at her as he talked, and she reached over and took his hand. She was looking out the window, and she spotted the boy who'd parked her car. He sure was a darling, such a beautiful physique. He looked tall and strong-limbed. He'd make some lucky young girl very happy some night soon. She knew it. Her heart fluttered as she thought that his finger had actually been inside her, and so recently. He looked up at her and caught her watching him. She smiled at him, and he gave her the most delightful wink. She didn't know what had gotten into her, but it certainly was something. She was like a new woman. Maybe it was moving to a new neighborhood that did it. Or maybe it was what had happened with the neighbor. allowing him to see her act so outrageously. She slipped off one of her shoes and allowed her foot to climb up and find Ben's crotch. Ben looked at her in surprise. "Janie," he said. "Relax, honey. You're a big shot. You're going to be working in Albany. You can get away with whatever you want." He looked at her questioningly. He didn't know what she meant by that. He must have been feeling some guilt for what was going on with his secretary. But right at that moment, she didn't care about that at all. She didn't care if he fooled around with that slutty dimwit at the office. She was going to do some fooling around of her own, and the more distracted he was, the better it would be for her. She felt around his crotch with her foot for his penis and rubbed it. Luckily, the table had a white tablecloth on it, so no one could see what she was doing. She rubbed his dick as much as she could. It was a little awkward trying to do it with her foot, especially because she couldn't see what she was doing. But from the look on Ben's face, he was enjoying it well enough. It certainly was daring. They never did things like this. But Janie had made up her mind that they were both going to start enjoying a few new pleasures in life, things that they hadn't been enjoying up till now. "What's gotten into you?" Ben said. He was practically squirming in his seat, letting her get her foot at his crotch from every different angle possible. She doubted she'd be able to make him come like this, but the naughtiness of being in public was getting them both excited. Then their waiter appeared. They'd finished eating and were nearing the end of the delicious bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon that Ben had ordered. "Can I get you two anything else?" he said. He was about Janie's age, not as good-looking as the valet attendant, but would still be good for a quick tussle in the bedroom. Janie kept her foot directly on Ben's crotch and rubbed it up and down slowly. The waiter couldn't see what she was doing because of the tablecloth, but it was still a thrill to be doing it with him standing right there. "No, thank you," Ben said. "We better get the bill." Chapter 2. Ben was in a hurry to get home, and Janie knew why. She was excited to let him see her in her new torsolette. She was going to reinvigorate this marriage, and there was nothing that was going to stop her from doing it, least of all Ben's secretary. They paid their bill and went outside. Ben gave his card to the attendant, and someone brought his car around. To Janie's delight, it was her boy from earlier. She smiled to herself, thinking of the boy as if he were hers. She really was getting naughty. "Is it okay if I pick up my car tomorrow?" she said to the boy. "Sure," the kid said. Janie wondered if he'd be there when she came tomorrow, but she couldn't ask in front of Ben. As they got into the car, she told Ben to give the kid a good tip. "We'll be regulars here," she said to him, and put her hand on his crotch. He gave the kid a 20. Janie daydreamed on the drive home. She thought about giving Ben head in the car, but then she had a much more exciting idea. She wanted him to see her in the new corset first of all, but she also thought, maybe if they made love with the curtains open, the neighbor might watch them. This thought was more thrilling to her than the thought of actually having sex with Ben. She felt a little guilty about that, but she knew Ben had been the one to start all this by sleeping with Susie. If he wasn't faithful, how could he expect her to be? They got home, and she led him up to the bedroom by the hand. "Sit," she told him. Ben sat on the bed. Janie made sure all of the lights were on, although they were dimmed, giving the room an alluring atmosphere. She also noticed that the curtains were open, luckily, as she didn't think she'd be able to open them now, in front of Ben, without him asking her about it. She stood in front of him in the middle of the bedroom. She had no idea if the neighbor was watching or not, and she didn't dare look outside. But even just the possibility that he was there, watching, excited her. She pulled her dress off over her head. At last, Ben would get to see the new corset. It had been bought for his pleasure, after all, and it was only right that he get a chance to see it. "Wow," Ben said. "You look so beautiful, honey." She looked down at her body. The garters were still fastened nicely to the corset, the stockings elegantly climbing up to the higher reaches of her thighs. Her vagina looked young and new and tasty, she thought. The corset fit perfectly, holding her body firmly and pushing her breasts forward as if offering them as a gift. She turned around so that Ben could see her butt, and she bent it toward him a little. "This is all yours, baby," she said. Then, she did something a little risky, but she couldn't help herself. She walked over to the window and bent forward, splaying her hands on the glass. She had her bum pushed out toward Ben, and he would think this was all for his benefit. But as she stood there, she looked out through the glass for any sign that the neighbor was there. She couldn't see if he was there or not. Then, just at that instant, she saw the light turn on in his room. He was there. Could he be signaling her? The thought sent a wave of pleasure through her. The light went back out. Now, she would give him a show, prove to him what a beautiful, sexy woman she was. "Get over here," Ben said. She wiggled her butt at him. "No, you come and take me," she said. Ben came over and took a hold of her from behind. "You look amazing," he said into her ear. "Then do something about it," she said. She could tell he was surprised. She was acting in a completely new way, and there was no way he wasn't noticing it. She was a thrill to be with tonight. She knew she was. "What are you waiting for, Daddy?" she said. She kept her hands firmly planted on the glass pane of the window and felt Ben taking his penis out of his pants. It was rock hard, and she felt it pushing against her soft, warm pussy. "Wet me," she said. "What?" "You heard me." She wiggled her butt again and tried to see up to the neighbor's window, see if he was still there watching, if he was touching himself. She wanted to please Ben, but most of all, she wanted to please the neighbor, give him a thrill, and increase his opinion of her. At some point, during the past few hours, she had decided that this neighbor was going to be a very important part of her future, and she wanted him to be as excited and enticed by her sexually as possible. She realized Ben was down on his knees, and she pushed her bum back into his face. "Lick it," she said. He cupped his mouth on her vagina and started licking her, like a little puppy, she thought. She'd never done anything like this in her life. She'd never spoken to Ben like this, never told him what to do, and certainly never ordered him to eat her. She didn't know where all this confidence was coming from, but she was becoming a completely new woman, more assertive and sexual, and she knew it was hot. She also realized, in a flicker of inspiration that flashed across her mind as she looked out across the yard to the neighbor's window, that she was outgrowing Ben. Maybe he would become a success in Albany, and maybe he wouldn't. But either way, she knew her future was bright, and that it would no longer be revolving solely around her husband. "That's right, Daddy," she said. "Eat it. Eat that pussy. Don't you dare stop till I tell you to." Ben was licking the lips of her vagina rapidly and hungrily. Her juices were flowing. She could feel it. And Ben was licking it all up and swallowing it. He was literally drinking her, and she loved it. She loved having so much power over Ben, who'd had the nerve to cheat on her with his secretary. And she loved knowing that the mysterious and wealthy neighbor was watching it all and judging her on it. I'll make them both come, she thought, and pictured both of their dicks exploding in a gush of semen because of the performance she was putting on. Chapter 3. Ben kept licking her vagina and drinking her juice, and she felt hotter and hotter as he did it. Look at him now, she thought. My puppy, doing whatever I tell him. If Susie could see him now, she'd have a different opinion of him. She knew the neighbor was out there watching too, and she knew in her heart that she was doing all this for his benefit. She was making Ben eat her, just so that she could impress the neighbor, give him something to watch, show him what a sexual creature she was. Don't forget the asshole, Daddy, she said, and this time there was no mistaking it. There was a definite hint of mockery in her voice as she said Daddy. It was as if she was taunting Ben, telling him that he would never be her daddy again. Eat every bit of it. Lick that asshole. Drink that juice. You're mine, and you'll do what I tell you. Immediately, Ben's tongue was on her asshole, licking it and probing into it. He was inserting it into her bum as far as it would go. She moaned in pleasure. She wondered what the neighbor was thinking of all this. She sensed that Ben was completely thrilled by this new, dominant woman in his bedroom. But all she really cared about now was what the neighbor thought of it. She arched her back, pushing her chest forward toward the window. She wished the neighbor could reach out and grab her breasts, and at the very least, she wanted to push them toward him and give him as good a view of her as possible. She looked out through the glass again, and for the second time that day, she saw that the neighbor was sitting there with his penis in his hand, jerking off to the sight of her. Yes, she thought, he likes it. She took her hands off the glass then and pressed her chest against it. She opened the string at the front of her corset so that her breasts spilled out, and then she pressed them as hard as she could against the cold surface of the glass. They were flattened against the window, pressed white against it, and as far as she was concerned, they were as close to the neighbor as she could make them. Then, she reached around behind her and grabbed Ben's head and pressed it in against her asshole as hard as she could. That's it, Daddy, she said, and again, there was a hint of taunting in her voice. Now, get down on the floor. Ben did exactly what she said and lay down on his back, facing up. She looked at his dick and saw that it was as full and eager as she had ever seen it. He was ready to explode, and she couldn't wait for all that semen to come pouring out of him. She wanted to bathe in it. Ben was lying on his back with his head toward the window, which was perfect for Janie's purposes. She crouched down carefully and sat on his face, facing the window and the neighbor who was out there, watching everything. As Ben licked and drank her pussy, his face squished under her flesh. She leaned forward and licked the glass of the window. It was as if she was saying to the neighbor, "This is all for you." And she knew the neighbor understood that, because he turned on the lights in his room again, showing her that he was completely naked. Gosh, she thought, what a thrill. Sitting there on Ben's face, she realized that she had better do something to please him soon, or he would get upset. There was only so much of this new assertiveness that he would enjoy. She got up and rearranged herself and Ben so that he was lying parallel to the window. Again, everything she did was for the benefit of the neighbor's view. She sat back down on Ben's face, but this time she was turned around so that she could lean forward onto Ben's penis with her mouth and 69 him. The neighbor's light was off again, and she hoped Ben wouldn't ask why they were doing everything by the window. It would be a disaster if he realized she'd been dominating him like this for the viewing pleasure of another man. She leaned forward and took him in her mouth, and she had never felt him so ready to explode in all of their marriage. She circled the tip of his penis with her tongue before opening wide and taking him as far back into her throat as she possibly could. Ben was licking and sucking on her clitoris like crazy, and she pounded her head back and forth on his dick so that they would come together. Janie's head bobbed up and down like a cheap hooker, sucking someone off in the back of a car. She was letting Ben's dick ram up into her throat again and again and again. And as she did it, she felt the sensation in her vagina build up until she began convulsing uncontrollably. It was the second time that day that she'd been throbbing with the ecstasy of orgasm in front of the neighbor. The feeling was sensational. Ben there, fucking her pussy with his tongue, while she felt the explosion of his semen in her throat. And most importantly of all, the neighbor was out there in the dark, watching it all, and hopefully ejaculating too. She wished she could have felt both ejaculations in her mouth at the same time. She wanted them all over her. She wanted to be used completely, not just by Ben, but by the neighbor and other men too. As she lay there on top of Ben, the pleasure of what had just happened flowed through her veins like a drug. She wondered what he would think about everything having taken place against the window. Would he notice that someone could see them? She also wondered if he would say anything about how assertive and dominant she had been. She thought she would spare him having to say anything by saying something first. "There's something about this new house, honey, that just brings out the slut in me." That seemed to please him, because he laughed where he lay. She got up and turned around and lay next to him. "Just look at that view," she said. "I can tell already we'll have a swimming pool like that, and we'll be rich and powerful, and we'll have so much pleasure in our lives. That view just says it all, Ben, doesn't it?" He smiled and nodded before closing his eyes. "Let's get into bed," she said. Chapter 4. By the time Ben was asleep, Janie was pretty exhausted. She'd showered before bed and changed into something that was a little more comfortable. She was wearing a pair of pink cotton panties and a camisole that matched. She lay down on the bed and kissed Ben, but she couldn't fall asleep. No matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't get the neighbor out of her mind. He'd seen more of her today than anyone else in the world had. Even Ben had never seen her riding a dildo with her asshole like a girl out of a porn movie. She felt there was a connection between her and the neighbor now, and she felt the need for closure with him before she let the day end. She made sure Ben was asleep, then went to her dresser and picked out a pair of lacy black panties from her drawer. She knew what she was doing was crazy, but she couldn't help herself. She took the panties and went downstairs. She went into the kitchen and opened the back door. It led out to a patio that stretched around to the back of the house, and she went out onto it. The boundary with the neighbor's property was marked by a hedge, but there were still gaps where it hadn't grown enough to fill them in. She brushed through the hedge and let the twigs scrape lightly against her bare legs. She went straight to that glorious swimming pool and looked into the crystal clear water. There were spotlights beneath the surface, and they made the water look warm and inviting. She looked up at the neighbor's window and saw no sign of life. What she was doing was really crazy. First of all, Ben could wake up at any moment, and if he went to the window, he'd see her down there. Secondly, She didn't know anything about the neighbor and his life. She didn't know if he was married. What if he had a wife, and she saw her out there, playing around in her underwear? Still, Janie just couldn't help herself. She had to cement the bond she'd formed with the neighbor during the day, and this was the only way she could think of doing it. She took her panties and threw them into the middle of the pool. The neighbor would see them there. She knew he would. Now that she'd actually thrown them into the water, she felt a flash of panic. What if Ben had seen her do it? What if the neighbor had a wife who'd find them first? It was too late to do anything about it now, though. So she just smiled. The panties were there, floating in the water, waiting for him to find in the morning, and she couldn't get them back. The thought gave her a rush of anticipation. Quietly, she crept back to her own yard and into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the counter to drink it. It really had been quite a day. Chapter 5. The following morning, Janie got up early and went straight to the window. The panties were gone. He must have found them. Maybe he'd even seen her throwing them there last night. The thought excited her. She went downstairs and put on the coffee, and when she got back upstairs, Ben was already in the shower. She thought she'd surprise him and went into the bathroom and pulled open the shower door. To her surprise, Ben was masturbating. He'd lathered his penis with shampoo and was beating away at it when she caught him. Janie had always been fast on her feet, and she knew exactly what to do to make sure she didn't embarrass him. Everything they'd done the night before had been a big leap forward for them sexually. It was a new beginning for their sex life, and she didn't want to jeopardize that now by embarrassing Ben. He was looking at her, his erect penis in his hand, and he didn't know what to say. He'd always been shy about things like this. Acting entirely on her quick instincts, she got down on her hands and knees and crawled away from him. When she reached the door, she looked back at him over her shoulder. She said, "I've been such a naughty girl, Daddy." There was none of the taunting in her voice that had been there the night before. She crawled across the bedroom floor to the bed and got on it and waited on her hands and knees for Ben. "You better punish me for being a naughty girl, Daddy," she said. And Ben gave her a punishing she didn't even know he had in him. He came over to the side of the bed and put a hand on her back. He pressed down hard on her back and kept her where she was, and with his other hand, he spanked her firm little rump as hard as he could. Janie could feel the flesh grow pink and raw with each smart, loud slap. "That's right, Daddy," she said. "I've been such a naughty girl." He stood there, holding her in place, and slapped her on the bum again and again. The pain thrilled her. She'd never had so much fun with Ben in her life. She squirmed and tried to get out of his grip, but he held her there firmly and kept spanking her. Eventually, she managed to get out from under his firm hold, and she turned around, still on her hands and knees, and purred like a kitten. "Let me make it up to you, Daddy." She saw that his penis was as firm and ripe as it had been the night before, and she bent down to it and licked his scrotum gently. She looked up at him and almost didn't recognize the look on his face. He looked so firm and manly. She licked his sack gently and took it in her mouth and sucked on it, being careful to do everything gently. She leaned back on the bed and stretched her legs up into the air. She grabbed her ankles and held her legs perfectly straight. It was quite a stretch. She felt as if she was doing some new and difficult yoga position. "Take me, Daddy," she said. Ben didn't waste any time at all. He leaped on top of her, and his penis just slipped right into her gaping vagina. He pounded in and out of her as hard as he'd ever done, and Janey moaned in pleasure as he did it. She couldn't believe she'd caught him jerking off in the shower. It was so unlike him. She must have really given him something to think about last night. Ben was pounding her so hard, and it felt so good, that she began to feel her body reaching again toward the exquisite climax of orgasm. "Yes," she said, over and over and over. And just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, Ben pulled out. "Stay there," he said. She had no intention of doing otherwise. He went into the bathroom and came back with a bottle of lotion. He poured it all over his dick and then rubbed some of it on her bum too, being careful to get it right inside her asshole. He penetrated her anus with his finger, something he'd never done before, and Janey let out a little cry of delight. "Punish me, Daddy," she said. "I've been so bad. Make me sorry." "You'll be sorry," Ben said, and there was a new, gravelly manliness to his voice. "Punish me hard," she said again. Ben pressed the tip of his penis against her anus and pushed hard. It didn't slip in, but Janey knew it would if he kept trying. She'd been able to get the dildo in, and that was wider than Ben would ever be. He seemed to be reconsidering the idea, and she didn't want him to change his mind. "Punish me, Daddy," she said. "I've been a naughty slut." And she wiggled her bum in front of him, teasingly. He pressed his penis against her anus again, and this time she felt it force its way in. She felt every single inch that he had to offer slide into her. Every second that he was forcing his way into her ass felt like an eternity of pleasure. And then he pulled out in a rush, and she moaned. Immediately, he was forcing his way back in. She felt like a virgin that was being violated for the very first time in her life. She screamed out in delight and held her ankles tightly in her hand as he plowed again and again into her tight, pink asshole. She looked into Ben's eyes, and he looked into hers, and pushed in and out of her like a machine. "Yes," she screamed as she came. Ben came at the same time as her, and then he pulled out, dripping the last little bit of semen onto the sheets. "Make sure that's cleaned up before I get home," he said. "Yes, Daddy," Janey said. Chapter 6. They spoke little on the drive into town. They crossed the Hudson, and Janey looked down at the flowing river with new eyes. She certainly wasn't sure what was going on with her life. She didn't know exactly what had gotten into her and Ben since they'd moved into the new house, but she was sure of one thing. Their marriage was enjoying a new burst of life. There was no denying it, and she liked it. She'd never been more excited. She had the neighbor to think about, for one thing. Then there was the valet kid who she'd let finger her vagina like it was nothing at all. And then Ben had taken her in the ass like he was an entirely new man, and she was some whore he'd picked up at a motel. She felt like their whole world was changing. Before they knew it, Ben would be working for a fancy new firm in Albany and would be taking in twice as much money as he was now. They would have a wonderful new life of power and wealth ahead of them, and all the pleasure in the world would be theirs for the taking. As she looked down from the bridge over the rooftops of Troy, that was the thought that struck her the hardest. There was so much pleasure in the world, and it seemed to be suddenly coming at them from every direction at once. And she thought, even the fact that Ben was having an affair with his secretary had its advantages. It meant that she could get away with far more than would be possible otherwise. Just yesterday, she'd been consumed with pain and jealousy over how to get Ben away from his secretary. But now, she saw the whole thing as just one more insignificant detail, something that would let her get what she wanted out of life. As they reached the front of Taroni's, Janie found that she didn't even care in the least that Ben was going into the office to see Susie. So what, she thought. He had his little plaything. But she was the one he'd married. And besides, she had playthings of her own now. "Goodbye, honey," she said as she hugged him in the car. She was surprised when Ben wouldn't let go of her. "I love you, Janie," he said. She kissed him. It was a long, passionate kiss. "I know," she said, and gave his penis a little squeeze through his pants. She got out of the car and blew him a kiss before watching him drive off. Then, she searched in her purse for her valet ticket. The restaurant wasn't open yet, but she could see, sitting on the steps, out front enjoying his morning cigarette, her boy. Her boy. That was really how she thought of him now. He was hers. Everything was hers. She could have whatever she wanted, and there was nothing that could get in her way. "Hey, kid," she said to him, and gave him a charming and provocative smile. "You ready to learn how to please a lady?" The boy looked up at her, and his mouth was agape. He looked her over, and she knew he was impressed. He'd never been with a woman as hot as her before. She was certain he hadn't. She'd purposefully worn some sexy yoga pants and a tight shirt that clung to her breasts and left her midriff exposed. She'd told Ben that she was going to the gym. The boy was speechless. "Well, quit staring like an idiot and take me to my car. I'm going to teach you how to go down on a girl like a pro." The boy got up and threw her the keys to her car. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Part 3. Chapter 1. Janie sat on her bed and stared out the panoramic windows at the neighbor's pool. She'd been sitting in her room all day, waiting for a sign that he was watching her. It had been 2 days since she'd thrown her underwear in his pool, and she hadn't seen a sign of him since. She was beginning to worry that she'd scared him off. Maybe she'd upset him by being so bold. She racked her brain for a way to get his attention, but she didn't even know if he was at home. It was pointless. It was senseless, in fact. She was a grown woman, and she didn't need to be wasting her time sitting around, hoping that her neighbor was watching her. There was just something about it, though. The feeling of being watched had given her such a deep thrill. Since it had happened, all she could think about was the neighbor. She wondered what kind of man he was. He was older than her, but she had no idea by how much exactly. He was wealthy, but she didn't know how wealthy, or how he had made his money. She found herself daydreaming about what sort of man he was, what kind of music and art and film he liked, what his interests were. She liked to imagine him as charming and intelligent, and she imagined meeting him in person, and the two of them hitting it off. All of this was crazy. She knew that. She was a married woman, and the reason she was here in Sunny Oaks was to fix her marriage, cement her relationship with Ben, and get him out of his job in Troy. Finding him a new firm to work for was crucial, because it would get him away from that slut of a secretary at his current office. The right firm would also get them both started on the social ladder that existed at the state capitol in Albany. She should have been spending her time finding out about the big firms in Albany, figuring out who was in the upper echelons of state politics, checking out which law firms were making the most money and winning the most important clients. Instead, she was sitting on her bed, gazing across the lawn at the neighbor's house, wondering where he was and whether he'd ever come back and watch her in her bedroom. The craziest thing about it all was that she seemed to get more of a thrill out of being watched by the neighbor than she did actually having sex with her husband. She'd even fooled around with that parking valet at Tironi's, flirting with him shamelessly, and even letting him touch her. That had been a brief but dangerous moment of absolute senselessness. It was just madness, plain and simple. She'd been aroused so utterly that day by the neighbors watching her that she'd acted out of character and allowed the valet to touch her. She'd even acted provocatively with him the following morning, flirting shamelessly and making suggestive comments when she'd gone back to get her car. But of course, nothing had happened. She couldn't explain that behavior. Was she beginning to lose it? She had a full life to lead with Ben. He was going to be a successful lawyer, and the two of them were going to climb the ladder to wealth, success, and happiness. If he caught her fooling around with parking attendants, he'd flip out. She'd lose everything. What had she been thinking? That wasn't her. She wasn't one to act so recklessly that she'd jeopardize everything she'd worked for in her life. She had a good, loving husband, even if he wasn't perfect, and she should be doing everything she could to help him advance his career right now. She got up off the bed and went into the bathroom. It was 10 in the morning, and she wasn't even out of her pajamas yet. She had to get a hold of herself. She couldn't spend the rest of the summer moping around, hoping the neighbor would come home and watch her making a fool of herself. She got in the shower and let the hot water wash over her body, trying to get a feeling of reinvigoration and life into her bones. She'd shake herself out of this rut she'd fallen into. After her shower, she got dressed and went downstairs, determined to be productive. She made coffee and toast, and after she'd eaten, she got the laundry organized. The laundry room in the new house was really nice. They had new, front-loading appliances that came with the house. Ben hadn't wanted to pay for them, but Janie pleaded and begged, and finally he'd agreed. She took a pair of Ben's pants from the washer and felt something in the pocket. She reached in and pulled out a candy wrapper. Then, she dropped it on the ground. Her face flushed red, and she felt as if she'd just been slapped hard across the cheek. She felt hot. It was as if the entire room had gotten hotter. It wasn't a candy wrapper at all. It was a condom wrapper. She and Ben didn't use condoms. She was on the pill. He was still screwing other women. It must have been from being with Susie. She touched her cheek with the back of her hand. It did feel hot. She went to the sink and ran the cold water and washed her face with it. She washed away her tears and tried to convince herself that she hadn't been crying at all. Why was Ben doing this to her? She couldn't bear the thought of it. She'd tried to convince herself that she didn't care what Ben did, that she was stronger than this, and that it didn't matter if he fooled around with his secretary. But it did no good. The pain ran sharp and deep. She wasn't strong enough to overlook this. She shut off the water and breathed deeply, trying to regain her composure. She wouldn't allow this to control her. She was master of her own emotions, and she would overcome this. She had to. She had decided not to bring up the affair with Ben. She wanted everything to remain calm and happy in their home, and she vowed she could do it. She finished the laundry as calmly as she could and went back upstairs. She sat at the bar in the kitchen and finished the pot of coffee she'd made earlier. She was numb. She forced herself to be numb. Whatever happened, it was self-control that she needed now. Not emotion or panic or grief, just control. As she finished the last of the coffee, the phone started ringing. On the caller ID, she saw that it was Ben calling. Chapter 2. Janie breathed in deeply and gathered all her strength before picking up the phone. She had decided that she wasn't going to ruin things by letting Ben know she knew about the affair. She was going to bear the whole weight of it alone, for the good of their marriage. That was how she'd been raised. That was what her mother had done. And that was what she would do, too. "Hello, honey," she said into the receiver. "I'm sorry?" A woman's voice replied. "Is this Janie?" "Yes, this is Janie Carver," she said. "Hi, Janie," the voice said. "This is Susie. Walter will be on the line in just a minute." "Okay," Janie said. Her voice sounded weak. She was motionless as a statue as she held the phone to her ear and waited for Ben to come on the line. She didn't know how Ben could have Susie place his call to her. He was having an affair with her. It was heartless. It might have been 10 seconds or 2 minutes that she had to wait for Ben. She had no idea. "Hello?" he said. "Hi, honey," she answered, trying to sound as normal and unaffected as she could. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing. I just burned myself." "Oh, I'm sorry, baby." "It's okay," she said as she flicked the kettle back on. "Is it bad?" "No, don't worry about it. Why did you call?" "I just wanted to let you know I'd be home late tonight." "Oh." She couldn't help it. Her voice cracked. "What is it?" "Nothing, honey. I just thought I'd cook us a nice meal tonight." "Sorry. Clients." "I understand." "Don't sound so disappointment. It's work, honey." "I know, Ben. It's just, I'm here alone all day. I was looking forward to your getting home." "You'll be fine. You'll figure out a way to entertain yourself. Watch a movie or something." "A movie? Will you be that late?" "I'm afraid so. You shouldn't wait up." "Okay," she said quietly. "Don't sound so upset. This is how we're paying for that house you wanted." "I know, Ben. Don't be mad at me. I'm just disappointed is all." "Well, there's nothing I can do about it." He was mad at her. She knew it was because he was being defensive. "Okay," she said. "Bye." She hung up and began to cry again. She'd been such an idiot. For months before the move, he'd been calling her and making excuses like that. That's how the affair with Susie had gotten off the ground. If she'd been firmer with him and forced him to come home to her right after work, her marriage wouldn't be in jeopardy now. It was her own fault for being so weak. And she'd just gone and done it again. She'd let him off the hook so that he could stay out late with Susie. She knew he'd be spending the night with her. He might even take her to Tironi's, for all she knew. She picked up the kettle and placed her left arm flat on the counter. Then, without even flinching, she poured a good measure of the boiling water onto her arm. As the pain of the burn flowed through her, she imagined that this was somehow getting back at Ben. She imagined that he would somehow suffer from this pain, that it would make him feel bad for cheating on her and putting her through such emotional agony. The truth was that the only person it hurt was herself. She ran the burn under the cold tap and then iced it. It had left a red scar about 3 inches wide on the inside of her arm. She went and lay on the couch and flipped through daytime television shows. It was a warm, sunny day outside, and she knew she should be outside making the most of it. But she just felt too depressed. She watched the mindless television and tried not to think of Ben and his slutty secretary. She didn't understand why it affected her so deeply. After all, she'd already known about the affair. But it did affect her deeply. It cut like a knife. She fell asleep on the sofa, in front of the television. When she woke, she looked at her watch and saw that it was 4 p.m. She'd wasted most of the afternoon. The burn on her arm ached, and she regretted doing that to herself. She got more ice from the freezer and soothed it as much as she could. Then, she went upstairs for another shower. She ended up lying in the bath for another half hour with her arm out of the water. She knew she had to find a way to pull herself out of this malaise, but she didn't know how to do it. She was afraid of what would happen when Ben realized how depressed she was. Things would come to a head, and she wasn't ready for that. After the bath, she got dressed in some sweats and tied her hair back. She ordinarily wouldn't go out in public dressed like that, but she couldn't bring herself to care. She got in her car and drove to the local grocery store. Inside the store, she wandered aimlessly down the aisles, throwing mostly snack food into her cart. They did need groceries, but she wasn't in the mood for buying real food, especially if Ben wasn't even joining her for dinner. She bought Oreo-flavored ice cream, microwave popcorn, chips and salsa, all things she usually wouldn't allow herself. There was also a machine that rented movies, and she put her credit card in the slot and chose a couple of romances at random. She threw them in the cart on top of the snack food and made her way to the checkout. Just as she got there, she saw someone familiar. It was him, the neighbor. He was all the way down one of the aisles, but he was unmistakable. He was wearing slacks and a golf shirt, and Janie knew she would recognize that perfect posture anywhere. He was tall and straight, and had a way of walking that made him look confident and in control. In a rash decision, she turned her cart down the aisle he was in and walked straight toward him. If she'd been thinking straight, she would have realized this was not the right time at all to let him see her up close for the first time. She'd been crying most of the day, and her eyes were red and puffy. She hadn't done her hair or applied her makeup very well, and she looked a complete mess. She was dressed in flip-flops and sweats, like some trailer park wife. She really shouldn't have been approaching him, but she couldn't help it. She needed him. Chapter 3. The neighbor was handsome. She had to give him that much. He looked distinguished and intelligent and athletic. His hair was white but full, and his skin was tanned to a light golden brown. He looked like he'd just come off of a boat. He was wearing the brown leather shoes she'd seen men on boats wear. She walked after him down the aisle. He was at the far end, picking up a few groceries. He rounded the corner to the next aisle, and Janie ran down after him. She went around the corner, and there he was, right in front of her, trying to decide which type of barbecue sauce he liked best. It was only then that Janie realized how rash she'd been. She looked a complete mess and probably seemed crazy, chasing some complete stranger around the store. She wished she hadn't run after him. She didn't have nice clothes on or any makeup. She'd become one of those women who wandered around the grocery store like a ghost while her husband cheated on her at the office. Her cart was practically touching his. He was standing there with a surprised look on his face. He hadn't expected to run into her like this. She was his kinky new neighbor, and he'd masturbated watching her. He seemed a little embarrassed. "Hello," he said uncertainly. Janie gave him a weak smile. Why had she rushed into this? She must seem desperate. The man was probably saying hello out of sympathy. He must be disappointed at how she looked in real life. She didn't look nearly as good as she had in the torsolette when he'd first seen her. He'd never look at her the same way again. She'd ruined it. "Hello," Janie said. "I believe I owe you an introduction," the man said. Janie didn't know what to say. This was so awkward. Why hadn't she just left the store? It was too late now to go back. "I'm Henry Walden," he said. His voice was deep and gravelly, just the kind of voice that Janie had imagined he would have. She could have closed her eyes and listened to it all night, I'm Janie, she said. Janie Carver. This was a disaster. He'd never be interested in her now that he'd seen her up close. She should have contrived a meeting at a better time. My husband is Benjamin Carver. We've just moved in next to you.
I noticed,
Henry said, and raised an eyebrow. Janie smiled in embarrassment. There followed an awkward silence. Henry was looking at her intently, taking her all in. He seemed to be drinking her up with his eyes. Maybe he wasn't disgusted by her after all. He seemed taken by her. She looked at his eyes, which were following the contours of her body, from her feet up along her legs, over her bum, and up to her breasts and face. She felt the thrill of being watched all over again. There was something about this man, about the way he made her feel when he looked at her, that she found intensely fulfilling and exhilarating. It was almost like he could do more with his eyes than Ben could even do with his hands. She began to feel a little better about herself, like his gaze was the sunlight bringing her back to life. She felt that maybe she'd been a little hard on herself. She'd been depressed all day, but that was only natural, given what Ben was up to. She was still a beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She might not have any makeup on, and her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail. But she had a beautiful figure, a pretty face, a nice complexion. I love your pool, Janie said, just to break the silence. Henry came back to her, as if she'd just woken him from a sleep.
Yes,
he said distantly. He'd been so intent on looking at her, it seemed he could hardly concentrate. It was strange that he was so taken by her, but it sure was doing her battered confidence some good.
Well, you can use it any time,
Henry said.
I live alone and hardly ever swim. It's a shame because it's a nice pool.
Thank you, Janie said. She imagined him watching her swimming in the pool. She imagined being naked in it.
Really,
he said.
I mean it. You go ahead and swim any time. I'm not even home most of the time, and I have a gardener that comes by a few times a week, and he maintains it perfectly. I'd be delighted to see you make use of it.
Janie looked up at him. He was handsome and seemed confident and capable, but there was an awkwardness about him too. She wasn't surprised to hear he lived alone. He had the air of a loner. She also felt a rush of desire when he'd said he'd like to see her in the pool. Maybe he meant that he'd watch her. He was welcome to. She honestly couldn't understand her own emotions or feelings right now, but something about the thought of him looking at her, watching her swim, made her feel more secure and safe than anything else she could call to mind. It was as if his gaze would be an embrace that would hold her and protect her. Well, Janie said, I'd better get going. He'd been looking at her again and seemed to find it difficult to concentrate on anything while in her presence.
Of course,
Henry said.
Of course.
He offered her his hand to shake, and she shook it.
It's been an absolute delight to meet you in person, Janie.
Likewise, she said, and wheeled her cart off toward the checkout. Chapter 4. When Janie got home, she threw the groceries on the kitchen counter and left the movies on the coffee table by the TV. Then, she went to the office and looked up Henry Walden. She was shocked at what she learned. She never would have guessed any of it from the unassuming man she'd met at the grocery store. His wiki page led her to his company website, and there was a detailed bio there. He was a doctor, a famous doctor. He'd been married in his 30s, and when he and his wife had their first child, they'd learned that his wife carried a rare genetic disorder. Henry spent the next 30 years researching the disorder at Weill Cornell. He started a company and built a dedicated research institute at the Cornell campus in Ithaca. He'd been obsessed. His company filed a number of groundbreaking patents, and after decades of hard work, he succeeded. His company finally developed an effective treatment for the disorder that was today saving lives all over the world. But unfortunately for Henry, his wife and daughter had long since succumbed to the disease. It was a tragic story, but a quick look at his company's stock price told her that it hadn't been entirely futile, at least not financially. Henry had netted millions by the time he retired a few years ago. It seemed he'd since been involving himself in charitable work, serving on the board of some local hospitals, and establishing a foundation to provide research grants to medical startups. He was quite a man. There were photos of him on the internet, shaking hands with the president. He'd also spent time with some pretty impressive celebrities who were personally touched by the disease he'd cured, or who had taken on the cause as one of their charitable projects. One picture showed him at a ceremony in a tuxedo with Brad Pitt and George Clooney. Janie printed it out and took it with her to the living room. She wanted to look at it while she ate her ice cream and watched her romances. She fell asleep during the second of the two movies, and when she woke up, the DVD menu screen was repeating the same snippet of music over and over. She looked at the table, covered with containers of melted ice cream and a half-empty bowl of butter popcorn. She regretted being so gluttonous. She'd have to find out about that gym soon before she put on weight. A few extra pounds was the last thing she needed while she was feeling so insecure in her marriage. She shut off the TV and gathered up the mess on the table and brought it into the kitchen. She saw the green digital display on her oven and was shocked that it was after 3 a.m. Where the hell was Ben? She rushed upstairs to see if for some reason he'd gone to bed without waking her, but the bedroom was empty. She picked up the phone and dialed his office number. There was no answer. She waited and waited as it rang, and she pictured the empty office with the lone phone ringing. No one was there. With a sick feeling in her stomach, she wondered if she should call his cell. She knew he'd hate her for doing it. He'd say he'd been with clients and didn't like interruptions. But she was his wife, and it was 3 a.m, so she was within her rights to interrupt anything. What stopped her from dialing the number was the fear that she might catch him with Susie. She knew about the affair, but she didn't want Ben to know she knew. Not that there could be much doubt. It was 3 a.m, and he still wasn't home. But she wasn't ready to face him on it. She wasn't ready to have the fight that it would lead to. And she wasn't ready to make the admissions to herself about her own life that the fight would force. She put down the phone. She switched on the bedside lamp and sat on the side of the bed and thought. She thought that Ben was growing more careless of her, more reckless. She'd wanted to move to Sunny Oaks to breathe new life into the marriage. But it was as if, with her being farther away from Troy, he felt he could think of her even less than before. He'd never stayed out this late before. She wondered briefly if maybe he'd been in an accident. He might have tried to drive home drunk and crashed. She put aside that thought. If there'd been an accident, she'd be contacted. The more realistic option was that he was asleep with Susie somewhere, too drunk to even realize that he wasn't in his own bed at home. She looked out the window across the way at the neighbor's house. Henry Walden, she said to herself quietly. She walked up to the glass. Look at me, she thought. Please, look at me. She didn't know what she was doing, but she felt so alone, and she just needed to know that someone in the world, even if it was just her eccentric neighbor next door, was thinking about her. She went to the light switch and turned on the lights. Then, she went back to the window and peered out across the darkness. Please look at me, she thought. The light in Henry's room came on. He was there, standing by his window, in the same clothes he'd been wearing earlier at the grocery store. Had he been waiting by the window all this time? Chapter 5. Janie stayed where she was and looked across at Henry. He stood, motionless, looking back at her. He almost could have been a statue or a mannequin. In fact, if she didn't know who he was or why he was standing there, she might have thought he wasn't real. She held up her hand in greeting, and he responded, holding up his hand. The way he did it made her picture someone standing on a pier, watching a loved one leaving on a ship for a very long journey. There was something so sad about the man. She felt strange, having learned so much about him. She'd read the salient points of his entire life and knew more about him than she knew about some members of her own family. At least, she felt she knew him. It made her wonder who was the bigger voyeur, him or her. He'd watched her get naked and play with a dildo, but she knew the most intimate details of his life. She decided she was going to take her clothes off. She didn't care that it was improper. Her husband still wasn't home, and she wanted someone to appreciate her beauty. She slipped out of her sweats and pulled her hair out of the ponytail it had been in since the day before. It felt good to be naked. It felt even better to be naked in front of Henry. She could almost feel his eyes on her bare skin. She closed her eyes and breathed out a long sigh and tried to concentrate on the fact that he was looking at her naked body. She tried to feel the connection with him, as if the effect of his gaze on her skin could in some way comfort her for what Ben was doing. It was different to being touched. She knew that. She loved being touched by men. At least, she'd loved being touched by Ben until he began cheating on her. This was different. There was no direct stimulation. No one was actually touching her breasts or her vagina with their hands or mouth. There was no penis for her to focus her concentration on. But it was still good. It was still a genuine connection that she was making with this man across the way, and it wasn't cheating on Ben. At least, it wasn't quite cheating. The thrill of being watched was a thrill of anticipation. It was as if she knew it would lead to something more physical eventually, and that was enough for the time being. Knowing it was almost as good as having it happen to her immediately. It was the pleasure of a good tease. The only thing about a tease, though, is that it leaves you wanting more. She didn't want to have sex with Henry. Not yet. She was still too committed to Ben and her marriage and to the goals that they shared. Even if he was willing to throw it all away for a brief fling with a secretary, that didn't mean that she was. She hadn't given up on her marriage yet, but she was getting something that she genuinely needed from her displays to Henry. And she was beginning to realize that it was something she couldn't do without. Right now, what she really wanted more than anything else was to be closer to Henry. She didn't want to be so close that he could touch her, but she wanted him to be watching her from closer quarters. She wanted to be able to see precisely his reactions as he watched her. She wanted him to be able to see her more clearly, more intimately. She pressed her body against the glass window, flattening her breasts against the glass. She thrust her pelvis forward so that her shaved cunt was pressed against the cold surface of the glass. It was closer, but it was nowhere near close enough. They were still separated by 20 yards of cold night air and 2 panes of window glass. She felt 1,000,000 miles away from him, and she felt lonely. She looked over at the phone. She remembered the feeling she'd gotten, waiting for someone at Ben's office to pick up. She allowed herself to feel the rage that his affair was stirring up in her. Then, she left the window and, still naked, grabbed a bath towel from the washroom and went downstairs. She knew that Ben could come home at any minute, but she didn't care. If he caught her doing what she was about to do, then at least it would bring things to a head. She wasn't afraid to confront him. Not right now, in this moment of utter loneliness and desperation. She walked, naked, to the kitchen door that led out to the patio and opened it. The cold air flew in and rushed over her skin in a ghostly embrace. She steeled herself against it and stepped outside onto the side patio. She walked across her lawn and through the hedge onto Henry's lawn. She looked up and saw that he was still watching her from the upstairs window. He hadn't moved a single muscle. She walked around to the back of the house, to the patio beside his pool, and threw her towel on one of the deck chairs. Then, she went to the diving board and stepped onto it. She felt vital and alive in the cool night air. Her naked skin exposed to the night like nature had intended. She felt like some nocturnal hunter on the prowl. It was a thrilling feeling to be naked outside at night. The diving board was long and white and took her out over the water. She stood at the end of it, her arms in the air above her head, and arched her back, pushing her breasts and vagina forward toward the water. Then, the pool lights came on. There were dozens of little spotlights built into the side of the pool, submerged beneath the water, and they made the pool look magical. Lights on the side of the house came on too, shining down on her and the smooth surface of the water. If any of the other neighbors were looking out their windows, they would see her there, naked as a nymph. She looked toward the house and saw Henry standing at his patio doors, as motionless as he had been upstairs. Now, he was so much closer, though. She was only a couple of yards from where he stood. She felt as if the power of his gaze had been amplified by the proximity. It thrilled her. In her pussy, right where a penis would be if she was being fucked, she felt a surge of pleasure. She turned and faced him, and silently mouthed the words that were going through her head over and over. "Look at me." Janie dived into the cool water in perfect form. She hardly made a splash. Henry stood by the glass, motionless as ever, and watched her swim back and forth, lap after lap, naked as a mermaid. She found that once she started swimming, she couldn't stop. It felt so good to be moving through the clear water, to have it flowing over her body. Knowing that Henry was there watching her muscles strain against the water gave her strength. Back and forth she went. She got into a rhythm and just kept going. It had been years since she'd swum like that. She swam competitively in college, but hadn't kept it up. She let her mind go blank now, the way she had in college. She began to remember how good it felt to be in the water. After about 15 minutes, she tired and got out of the pool. Of course, Henry was still standing there at the glass, watching every move she made. With the water dripping off of her, still out of breath from her exertion, she walked over to the glass door that Henry was at and stood right in front of him. He smiled faintly. She put her hand up against the glass. He put his hand up to it and touched her through the glass. She leaned forward, pressing her breasts against the window pane. He looked at her breasts, and for some reason, she felt like crying. She allowed a few forlorn tears to fall down over her cheeks. It was as if she'd entered a different world, a world where her life wasn't falling to pieces around her. She was yanked back to the present when she saw the lights of a car drive by and pull around into her driveway. Ben was home. She gave Henry one final glance before running naked through the hedge to her kitchen. She could hear the garage door opening and made a dash for the stairs. She'd left her bath towel out by the pool, but she hardly cared. She got to the bedroom and went straight to the shower. She didn't relax till the hot water was rolling down over her body, soothing her and warming her after the chill of the night air. By the time she got out, Ben was snoring on the bed. He hadn't taken off his suit, and he was lying on top of the covers. He'd never even knocked on the bathroom door to tell her he was home. She went over to the window and looked out across the lawn. Henry wasn't there. Chapter 6. The next morning, Ben woke up late for work. He had a hangover and was in a foul mood. "Want me to make some coffee?" Janie said as Ben stepped into the bathroom.
Sure,
He mumbled. She went down to the kitchen and put on water. Then, she scooped 2 measures of coffee into the French press and waited for the water to boil. She went over to the patio doors to look outside and gasped in surprise. She stepped back from the doors with a hand over her mouth. She couldn't believe it. Henry's entire swimming pool had somehow been filled with red roses during the night. There were thousands of them. The entire pool was like a carpet of flowers. How had he managed to arrange that in such a short time? Janie felt tears forming in her eyes. It was the kindest, most romantic, most loving gesture she had ever seen in her entire life. What kind of a person would do such a thing? She wanted to dive into the pool and bathe in the flowers. She wanted to swim in them. And most of all, she wanted to let Henry know that she appreciated the huge gesture he had made. She supposed this meant he liked her using his pool. She was still standing by the patio doors when Ben came downstairs.
"Where's the coffee?"
He said. He looked a little better now that he'd showered and shaved, but his mood hadn't improved much. "Sorry, it's coming right now." She poured hot water over the coffee grounds and waited for it to brew. She felt awkward being there with Ben. She felt she had to say something about his coming home so late, but she didn't see the point. She knew where he'd been. He'd been with his secretary.
"Sorry about last night,"
he said sheepishly. She looked at him and nodded. "You were home pretty late."
"I know. It's these new clients."
"Ben, I don't care who it was." Ben was looking at the ground, shaking his head.
"I know,"
he said.
"I know. We'll do something nice tonight, okay?"
"Will we?"
"Definitely. Why don't we meet in the city for dinner?"
"Okay. I'll call you later and we can firm up a plan." She handed him some black coffee in a travel mug.
"Do we have any aspirin?"
"I don't think so. You'll have to pick some up." Once Ben left, Janie felt much calmer. She was glad the house was empty again. It seemed the more time she spent away from Ben, the more she enjoyed the solitude. She had felt as if there'd been an intruder in the house since Ben got home last night. Now it was hers again. She went to the front of the house to make sure Ben's car was gone, and then she slipped out of her pajamas and left them on the hall floor. She walked straight back to the kitchen and opened the patio doors and stepped out into the cold air. This was becoming something of a habit, she thought, but she couldn't help it. She grabbed one of the poolside lounge chairs and lay on it. It was hardly 8 in the morning, and the air was so chilly that steam was rising up from the pool through the roses. The flowers were so rich and beautiful looking. She decided that however long it took, and however cold she got, she would lay naked on that lounge until Henry saw her. She wasn't sure what she was trying to accomplish, and she wasn't sure what would happen when he saw her, but she didn't care. She wasn't going back into her house to face another desperate day of loneliness while Ben cheated on her. In the chilly air, her nipples hardened and goose pimples popped up on her arms and legs. She looked ghostly white. A few minutes passed, and she was visibly shivering, but she didn't care. She looked at all those thousands of red rose heads floating in the pool and thought there was nowhere else in the world she should be but here. When Henry came down to his kitchen and saw her out on the recliner, shivering like a homeless puppy, he came straight out.
Mrs. Carver?
Janey looked up and saw Henry standing above her in his robe.
Come inside at once, he said. You'll catch your death out here.
He took her by the hand and rushed her into the kitchen, shutting the patio door behind her.
Let me get you a blanket, he said.
No, she said. I don't need anything.
You're freezing.
I don't care. I don't want to be covered up. I feel like I've been covered up my entire life. She hugged her body with her arms for warmth. Henry looked at her a few seconds, his eyes drinking in her naked, white flesh.
Well, let me put up the heat then, he said.
He walked over to a digital thermostat on the wall and pressed the plus button a few times, setting the house temperature well above normal. Immediately, Janey felt warm air flow from a vented slit by the floor. It felt a lot better.
This kitchen has heated floors, Henry said. It should warm up pretty soon.
Thank you, Janey said. It was a strange situation. She was sitting at the counter in this almost complete stranger's house, stark naked. She looked at Henry. He smiled back at her.
I'll put on some coffee, he said.
That would be nice. He had a very fancy-looking espresso machine, and he scooped coffee from a steel tin and placed a metal filter carefully on the scoop. Then he cranked it into place and hit a switch. Within a few seconds, a delicious aroma of fresh coffee filled the room. He heated some milk on the stove and poured her a cup of hot milk and then poured some espresso into it. Thank you, she said. He nodded, as if making her coffee was something he did every single morning. She felt surprisingly comfortable, sitting naked at Henry's breakfast bar, sipping coffee. She felt again the warm, protective feeling of Henry's gaze on her bare body. Thank you for the flowers, she said to him softly.
You're welcome, Janey. May I call you Janey?
Of course, she said, smiling.
You're a very beautiful girl.
I don't know how you managed to get so many roses delivered on such short notice. He smiled.
I have some friends in the business.
Janey finished her coffee and then looked at Henry, returning his gaze. What are we going to do? She said, and smiled as wickedly as she knew how. She had no idea what she was doing or what she was suggesting, and she felt a little guilty for being in this elderly man's home, completely naked, as if she was who was taking advantage of him. But she really didn't care. She needed his attention, and she wasn't willing to spend another day putting on a show for him from across the lawn. She wanted to take things farther. She looked down at her arm and the red burn mark on it. Ben hadn't even noticed. She wanted to get even. Chapter 7. Henry looked at her long and hard.
He's hurting you, isn't he?
She was disarmed by the question. Who? My husband? Henry nodded. Janey felt a tear fall down her cheek. It was true. He was hurting her. He's sleeping with his secretary, she said.
I see.
Henry looked like he understood. Maybe he'd experienced some similar pain in his life, although she couldn't imagine that he had. I just feel, I don't know. I feel like I need some attention.
That's understandable, Henry said. He looked at her. His eyes moved from her face down to her breasts and then to her thighs. Janie opened her legs, giving him a clearer view of her delicate vagina. He swallowed. She began rocking on the chair a little, in anticipation for whatever was going to happen between them. She was so ready to get even with Ben that she could burst. I just have one condition, Henry said.
What do you mean?
If we're going to do this, I want you to promise me something.
Janie looked into the old man's eyes. She felt instinctively that she could trust him. Okay,
she said. I don't want you to use me as a crutch. I don't want you using what we have as a means of coping with a bad relationship at home.
Okay,
she said, more carefully. Sometimes people need an escape. That's fine. I understand that completely. But use the courage that you gain to face your fears and challenges, not to run away from them.
Janie nodded. She wasn't really ready to be dealing with the issue of Ben's affair. She'd been telling herself that it would go away on its own. She'd hoped that by moving out to Sunny Oaks, the affair would disappear. Now, she had a complete stranger talking to her about it. Were her problems that obvious? She supposed they must be. Please just take me upstairs, she whispered. Chapter 8. Henry's bedroom was enormous. It was decorated in a minimalist modern style. Everything was sparse and simple, but also very expensive. It was a very masculine sort of luxury. Janie saw the window that Henry stood at when he watched her. It was at one end of the room, and at the other was the bed. Nice view, Janie said, and smiled. Henry nodded. He seemed quiet. There was a black leather armchair with a steel frame by the bed, and he sat on it. Are you okay? He nodded again. He hadn't spoken since they'd entered the room. It's been a long time since anyone's been in this room other than me. Oh, Janie said. I'm sorry. Oh no, child. You have nothing to be sorry for. In fact, you're giving a beautiful gift to a very lonely old man. Don't be sorry for 1 second. She nodded. She was still naked. It was growing accustomed to being naked in his presence. She felt as comfortable with Henry naked as she did with most people clothed. What do you want me to do? She said. Henry looked at her then, as if seeing her for the first time. His gaze started on her feet and ankles, and then made their way up her long, thin legs to her thighs, vagina, stomach, breasts, neck, and finally her face. His eyes met hers. He motioned to the bed, and she climbed onto it. It was the largest bed she'd ever been on. It must have been custom made. It was longer than the average bed, but it was even wider than it was long. Even the mattress and sheets must have been custom ordered. Sit and face me, Henry said. His voice was calm and kind, but there was also no doubting that he was in control. He told her what to do in the manner of someone who was used to being obeyed. It was as if she was one of his research students, and he was directing her in some complicated scientific procedure. He respected her intelligence, but needed her to do exactly as he said. She was sitting with her legs spread open, exposing her vagina to him clearly. She moved up and down slowly, partly from nerves, partly from excitement. She felt utterly exhilarated to be here in front of him, so close he could reach out and touch her. Touch it, he said. She looked down at her sweet little pussy. It looked perfect. She knew it did. The skin was smooth and silky. The flesh of her inner thighs was white as clean snow, and as it approached the outer lips of her vagina, it gradually turned to a light pink. From there, it grew redder as it approached the innermost lips of the vagina. She felt like a delicate flower. That was what it was like when Henry looked at her, with so much longing and love in his face. She could almost feel it. She put her finger in her mouth and touched the outer side of the inner vaginal lips, gently pushing on the little flaps of skin that formed her clitoris and that were capable of giving her so much exquisite pleasure. As she rubbed the clitoris, blood flowed into it, filling the area with life and sensation and making it puff and redden in its signal of sexual readiness. Henry was watching intently, his mouth slightly open, his hand slowly moving from his side to his crotch and inside the fold of his robe. She knew he must be growing hard under the robe, but she couldn't see his cock. Not yet. She strained to open her legs wider. She wanted him to see absolutely everything she had to offer. She wanted to give his eyes more pleasure than he had ever known before. Most of all, she wanted him to feel some sort of love for her, something that she could count on, while Ben played with his secretary and treated her as if she was utterly disposable and worthless. She pushed her index finger slowly into the mouth of her vagina. She was growing wet, and it slid in easily. She forced it in as deeply as she could reach, but felt it wasn't nearly long enough. A finger was such a small implement, she thought. She pushed her finger in and out of her vagina, letting it get all wet, trying to stimulate being fucked by a hard cock. Then, she took 2 fingers and slid them in together. The extra girth gave her some more pleasure, but again, she felt it wasn't enough. "Turn around," Henry said. She looked at him, and he held her gaze, his caring eyes meeting hers levelly. She got on her hands and knees with her bum facing him. Then, she reached around and fingered her vagina again. "Do the bum," he said. His voice cracked. He may be used to giving orders, Janey thought, but it wasn't every day that he told a girl to finger her bum. Her finger was already nice and wet from her cunt, and she touched her anus with it. That was more like it. For some reason, she felt more excited, naughtier, now that she was playing with her bum. She pushed her finger into her little asshole and let out a quiet moan. She moved it in and out of her anus, in and out, in and out. She looked back and saw that Henry was stroking his long, thick cock openly now. She wanted to offer to do it for him, to make him come, but she wasn't sure if the contact would be too much for him. Right now, it seemed like all he wanted to do was watch her. She pulled open her butt cheeks with her hands so that he could get a really clear view of her anus. She continued fingering it. This time, she used 2 fingers together. The extra width was startling, and the slight pain, mixed with the pleasure, caused her to cry out. "That's it," Henry said. "Now do both together." She looked back at him, but he was transfixed on her bum. She reached back and stuck her thumb into her anus and her index and middle fingers into her cunt. She had made a claw shape with her hand and used it to push in and out of both holes at once. It was a thrill to have Henry sitting there, stroking himself as he watched her. Janey felt awfully slutty being there. She was a married woman, after all. But she also delighted in the attention that she was getting from Henry, and the revenge she felt she was getting on Benjamin for his cheating. She continued to finger herself and she looked back at Henry. His large cock was in his hand, and he was stroking it slowly, up and down.
"That's beautiful, Janie," Henry said.
"Do you want me to do more?"
"What do you mean?"
She looked at his penis. "I could suck you," she said.
"Oh,"
Henry said. He sounded surprised, as if it had never crossed his mind that she might actually make contact with him.
"Are you getting bored?"
he asked.
"I'm not doing enough for you."
"No, Henry. Gosh, please don't think that. It's just, I thought you might enjoy it." He nodded his head.
"I understand,"
he said.
"Of course you want to make contact. You want satisfaction. It's only natural. I'll tell you what. You stay right there. I'll make a phone call."
"What do you mean? Who are you calling?"
"A friend. Don't you worry who it is."
"Oh, Henry, you can't."
"Hush, child. He's a good friend."
"But Henry, I thought this was just something between you and me. I thought we were doing this together."
"We are, Janie. Believe me, this means the world to me. It's just, I'm not ready for physical contact. I've been through a lot of pain in my life, a lot of emotional grief, and I'm unable to give you what you may be in need of."
He spoke slowly and awkwardly. He was afraid of not being able to satisfy her. He was shy and timid. It was strange, given how confident he seemed when he told her what to do. "Henry, you have nothing to be afraid of. I want to touch you. I want us to do this. Please don't be afraid of me. We can take things as slowly as you like."
He shook his head and looked down. "You don't understand, Janie. It's been a very long time since I've been with a woman. I'm simply unable right now. Maybe sometime in the future I'll feel differently, but right now I'm not able to make the leap toward full contact. It's too much."
She looked at his sad, lonely eyes. She wondered how long it had been since he'd felt the comforts of a woman. She knew it had to be over 10 years since his wife and child had died. She didn't want him to know that she'd read his life history, so she said nothing about it. She thought that was the reason for his inability to make contact, though. "Are you sure you don't want me to suck you, Henry? I'd be glad to do it. I want to do it. My husband's been cheating on me for months. I need to do it for my own sense of self-worth."
He shook his head. "I know, Janie. You stay put. I'm going to make a call and take care of this." He got up and left the room. She felt foolish in the room now that she was alone. She was naked and alone in her elderly next-door neighbor's house. She got up off the bed and looked across the lawn at her house through the window. What was she doing over here? She was being incredibly reckless. She knew nothing about Henry other than what she'd read on the internet, and now she was naked in his bedroom while he called a friend. It was ludicrous. She should get out of that house right away. Before Henry returned, she should leave. She should be home in 2 minutes and out at the gym or the mall or something, doing what a normal wife should be doing within the hour. She pictured what her day would be like if she left, and she knew she wouldn't go. She didn't want to be one of those forgotten, mistreated women whose husbands left the house in the morning to go fuck other women. She was a lot of things, maybe even a slut, but at least she wasn't sitting at home watching television or going to the mall and buying clothes that no one would ever care about. Henry came back into the room. "I called a friend," he said. She turned and looked at him from the window where she stood. "Oh," she said. "Now, before he gets here, I have a few things I want you to do. You have to be prepared." "Okay.
she said. She wasn't sure what he wanted her to do, but she was glad that the certainty and assertiveness had come back into his voice. She wanted him to be in charge. She wanted him to know what was going on and to take the lead. He made his way toward the washroom.
"Follow me,"
he said. Janie followed him into the washroom. He was sitting on the side of the bathtub. It was built into the room and had a low wall around it, tiled in an exquisite green stone. He was sitting by the toilet.
"Pee, please,"
he said. "I beg your pardon?"
"Janie, if we're going to do this, then you have to obey me."
That was the Henry she liked the best, the one who was sure of himself and knew what he wanted. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable doing that, Henry." Janie had never peed in front of anyone in her life. She hadn't even peed in front of Ben, and they'd been married 5 years.
"Do it,"
Henry said forcefully. Slowly, she went over to the toilet and sat on it.
"Go on,"
Henry said. Janie wasn't sure if she'd be able to pee in front of him, but she surprised herself. Pee started pouring from her pussy into the toilet, and before she knew it, a full stream was flowing down into the water.
"That's it,"
Henry said when she was finished.
"That wasn't so difficult now, was it?"
She shook her head.
"Now, I want you to shave. You have to be perfect for my friend."
"Shave? Are you sure?" She was wiping herself with some tissue paper, and she reached back to flush the toilet. Henry took a man's disposable razor and a tube of shaving foam from the vanity and handed them to her.
"Come over here,"
he said.
"Get in the bath."
Henry stayed where he was, seated on the side of the bathtub, but he reached over and ran the hot water. Acting more obediently than she would have thought possible, Janie did as she was told. She waited for the bathtub to fill up and then checked the temperature. It was about right, so she stepped in and sat up on her knees. Then, she took the shaving foam from Henry and sprayed some onto her hand. She wasn't used to using foam like this, but she lathered it onto her vagina. She was surprised at how cool and soothing it felt. She took the razor and carefully shaved around her vagina, Henry watching all the while.
"Good,"
he said when she was finished. He got her a towel, and she stood up, and he dried her off like a child. Then he brought her back into the bedroom and told her to wait on the bed. Janie wasn't sure how she felt about what had just happened. It was an extremely strange experience. She felt as if she trusted Henry, but things were beginning to get a bit weird, and she was apprehensive about whoever he might have called up. Still, she didn't do anything to remove herself from the situation. She knew that she would much rather be here with Henry, playing to his kinky fetishes, than at home alone. She lay on the bed and let him look at her for about 10 more minutes, his eyes fixed on her. She wanted to talk to him, but he was so lost in concentration that every time she said something, it seemed to distract him from his thoughts. It seemed all he wanted to do was feast his eyes on her beautiful body. At last, a car pulled into the driveway.
"That will be my friend,"
Henry said. Janie wasn't sure if she was scared or excited. "Who is he?" she said.
"You'll see in a minute."
The friend must have known Henry well, because he let himself into the house without ringing the bell.
"We're up here, Malcolm,"
Henry called out. Malcolm entered the room and was immediately taken by Janie. It was no wonder. She was lying on a bed, completely naked, waiting for him to fuck her. It was such a strange situation, but she was past the point of caring about propriety. She wanted this man's cock in her pussy, and that was what she was going to get
Or at least, that was how it seemed. "Ah, Malcolm, allow me to introduce you to my neighbor and friend, Janie Carver. Janie, this is Malcolm French, a business associate of mine." Malcolm was a little younger than Henry, but not much. He was probably in his mid-50s, tall, with grayish hair, and a handsome face. He was clean-shaved and in good physical condition. He had a tan like Henry's, and Janie imagined that they probably spent a lot of time together, golfing or yachting. "I'm enchanted," Malcolm said, from where he was standing next to Henry. Janie smiled up at him as she lounged languorously on the bed. She sucked in her stomach and pushed out her breasts and bum, trying to heighten her sexual attractiveness. She was doing an excellent job, if Henry and Malcolm's reactions were anything to judge by. They were both watching her every move. She felt important and special to be lying there, receiving all of their attentions. "You'll go easy on her, I'm sure," Henry said to Malcolm. Malcolm nodded. Henry looked at Janie questioningly. He raised an eyebrow, as if to ask if this was okay with her. She nodded. She was okay with this, whatever this was, and definitely wanted it to continue. Malcolm took off his blazer and put it on the back of Henry's chair. He began opening the buttons on his white shirt, one at a time. Janie got up on her knees in front of him and helped open his pants. She felt inside his shorts and found his hardening cock and took a hold of it. She pulled it out of his shorts so that she could look at it. This was the penis that was going to allow her to get even with Ben. This was her ticket. She felt that if she could just get this cock to orgasm in her pussy, she'd be showing Ben and Susie that she wasn't weaker than they were, and that she had as much a right to happiness as either of them did. Malcolm pulled off his shirt and got out of his pants, shorts, and socks so that he was completely naked. He got up on the bed next to Janie and began kissing her passionately. He was a pretty good kisser. Not bad at all for a 50-something-year-old. Janie let him kiss her, even though it gave her a strange feeling of guilt. She looked over at Henry while she kissed Malcolm. He had pulled the leather armchair closer to the bed so that he could watch closely as she and Malcolm made love. She felt as if having Henry there made everything okay. It was as if his presence legitimized the encounter. Malcolm reached up and took a hold of her breasts and began to knead them softly in his large hands. The way he was gently massaging them felt exquisite. Janie leaned her head back and let Malcolm lick and kiss her neck and breasts. He took a nipple in his mouth and sucked on it while lightly pressing the other between two fingers. She leaned back and got off her legs, wrapping them around Malcolm's well-built torso. He took his cue and began to move down her body with his mouth, stopping when he reached her aching, pulsing vagina. For so many years, Benjamin Carver had been the only man who was allowed access to that special place on her body. She felt cheated at all the years of faithfulness and devotion she had given him. It was time for her to break free. First, she'd let that valet touch her. Now, she was letting this man, Malcolm, caress the folds of skin around her pussy with his mouth. She breathed out in pleasure as he took the inner lips of her pussy into his warm, wet mouth and sucked gently. He sucked on the skin and flesh, pulling blood into the nerves and creating an ecstasy of pleasure down in her clitoris. She closed her eyes and arched her back, thrusting her pussy into Malcolm's face. Her breasts were arched forward, her head pressed downward into the mattress. The feeling of being eaten by a stranger was exquisite. She flushed as she reached a series of gentle orgasms that fluttered throughout her body and continued for over a minute. All the while,
Malcolm kept sucking the flesh of her clitoris. She felt her face and body go red from the exertion. She was breathing heavily, and her whole body was trembling from the orgasmic reaction that had occurred inside of her. She opened her eyes and looked at Henry. He was watching every moment intently. His hand was on his penis inside his bathrobe, and he was rubbing himself. She locked eyes with him, and she felt almost as if he was looking right down into her soul with his sad, longing eyes. She knew that he wanted to be the one fucking her, but he couldn't. Not yet, he had said. For now, all he could do was watch. He was so close to her that he could smell her body, see every drop of liquid that came out of her, but he couldn't touch her. It may have been the first time in many years that he had seen a woman climax up close, and it seemed to have affected him. "Hold out your hand," she said to him. He brought his hand out of his robe, where it was rubbing his throbbing cock, and held it out to her. She licked it and spat on it, making it wet with her saliva. "Now rub yourself," she said to him. He thanked her with a silent smile and put his wet, lubricated hand back on his cock and began stroking it. Malcolm looked up. He could tell she had orgasmed and was no longer sucking her clitoris. She pushed her pussy forward. She wanted him to suck her some more, but he was already climbing up onto his knees. He brought his cock up to her pussy, and she spread open her legs so that he could enter her. Malcolm slid into her like a sword into a silken sheath. It felt perfect to have a rock-hard cock in her cunt after all her years of dealing only with Ben. She cried out in pleasure as Malcolm began thrusting back and forth. He grabbed her ankles and rested them on his shoulders. She cried out and tried to maintain eye contact with both men. Henry was enjoying every second of it, and needless to say, so was Malcolm. "Please don't come inside her," Henry said. "I want to see the orgasm." Malcolm nodded at Henry, but did nothing to slow down the steady thrusting rhythm that he had set. Janie felt utterly naughty with her legs up in the air, and both men having so much pleasure watching her. She didn't care. The sluttier she got, the more she was able to get back at Ben. She clenched her fists as a second wave of delicious orgasms, this time harder than the first, began to surge through the muscles in her groin, shattering all thought. "Harder," she cried out. "Harder, Malcolm." Malcolm pushed into her with so much force and strength that it surprised and thrilled her. She loved every thrust his penis made, deep into her vagina. She was sure Ben never got this deep, either with her or with Susie. She was sure Susie didn't feel this good when Ben was inside her. The orgasms pulsed around inside her like bullets ricocheting inside a steel room. She screamed and grew flushed and gasped for air. Both men watched her so intently that she grew embarrassed once the orgasm subsided. It was broad daylight, and she'd never even allowed herself the freedom to have a climax like that in the privacy of her own home. She reached out and held Malcolm's body, stopping him from continuing. "Do me from behind," she said. She flipped over onto her knees, pointing her little bottom at Malcolm and wiggling. She made sure she was at a good angle for Henry to watch. It was both of them she was intent in pleasuring, and she wanted to make sure Henry could see her getting anally ravaged. She reached around and grabbed her butt cheeks with her hands and pulled them apart, displaying her anus to the two men. "Fuck me in there," she said. Malcolm looked at Henry before proceeding. Then he took his finger and pressed it past the tight ring of muscle into Janie's asshole. "Yes," she cried out, a mixture of pleasure and pain surging through her asshole. "Now take me, Malcolm. Take me hard." Malcolm ran his finger in and out of her asshole, creating an incredible sensation of pleasure that almost made her want to cry. Then he pulled out his finger and pressed the tip of his throbbing, aching penis against the asshole. Janie pushed back against it, and with a little help from some body lotion that Henry gave to Malcolm, the solid cock began to slide far into her anus. Malcolm began his rhythmical pumping again. Janie bent her arms at the elbows and lay her head on the bed, giving Malcolm the perfect angle from which to pump her little ass all he wanted. "Yes," she cried out again and again as she turned to face Henry. He was looking at her so lovingly and so lustfully, but she could also tell that his cock was getting close to orgasm. She thought of all the pumping Malcolm was doing and realized he must be getting close to his climax too. "Come on my face," she said. "What?" Malcolm said. He was so caught up in ramming his cock in and out of her asshole that he hadn't heard what she'd said. "Come on my face," she said again. Malcolm looked at Henry again and then pulled out of her bum. She turned around and lay on her back with her head beneath Malcolm's cock. Henry and Malcolm both had the perfect view of her pretty face, and she opened her mouth encouragingly. "Both of you," she said, looking straight at Henry. "Both of you come on my face." It was Henry's turn to look at Malcolm, as if verifying what she had said, and then he stood up from his seat so that his cock was now over Janie's face. This was perfect, Janie thought. This way, he could cover her with semen without ever having to touch her. The two men masturbated in unison, and Janie opened her mouth as wide as she could as they both approached gushing climaxes. Together, the two cock tips began to squirt out streams of white, hot liquid, and she closed her eyes and kept her mouth open, trying to catch as much of it in her mouth as she could. It was the taste of sweet revenge. If Ben could see her now, he would literally die. The semen squirted in her mouth, on her cheeks, in her eyes, in her hair. She didn't care. She wanted it all. She licked her lips and swallowed everything that had fallen into her mouth, and then opened her eyes and looked up at the two men. "Now you come, my darling," Henry said to her. "I did already. Lots of times." "Come again," he said. "Come with our jizz on your face." Still lying on her back, her face covered in both men's jizz, she began rubbing her hand rapidly over her clit, probing her cunt with her fingers, and moving the folds of vaginal flesh as fast as she could, until she began to feel the sensation of orgasm running up from the depths of her groin again. Suddenly, she began thrusting her body, as if she was being shocked with surges of electricity. The men's eyes widened in surprise and joy as she convulsed in yet another delicious orgasm right in front of them. When she was finished, she wiped her face on the sheets and asked Henry to bring her a towel. Then Malcolm dressed, and both men rose to leave. "You have a bath," Henry said to her. "You're welcome to have a nap too, if you like." They left her in the room. She went into the bathroom and had a quick shower, and then got into Henry's bed, naked. She slept for about 30 minutes, and when she woke, she could hear Malcolm and Henry downstairs. She felt utterly refreshed and rejuvenated. She was ready to face Ben and whatever infidelities he was attempting to commit. She felt that now she would no longer be the weaker party. She went downstairs, still completely naked. She had no clothes to wear at Henry's. The two men were drinking coffee at the counter. She walked over to Malcolm and kissed him gently on the mouth, allowing him to push his tongue into hers. Then she stood in front of Henry. "Please don't send me home without a kiss," she said. He looked scared, but he leaned forward and kissed her like a gentleman, softly,
on the lips. This has been The Neighbor, Parts 1 through 3, Lust in the Suburbs. Written by Abby Weeks. Narrated by Bailey Varnas. Copyright 2013 by Abby Weeks. Production copyright 2014 by Abby Weeks.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.